Brian Evans is Professor of Urbanism and Landscape at the Mackintosh School of Architecture, the Glasgow School of Art, and Director of the Glasgow Urban Laboratory, and previously Artistic Professor of Urban Design and Planning at Chalmers School of Architecture in Gothenburg. He's been a partner with Gillespie's, the international design practice, Deputy Chair and Chair of Design Review with Architecture and Design Scotland, and an enabler with the Commission for Architecture in the Built Environment. He's founding director of the Academy of Urbanism and has advised the United Nations, Geneva, on cities in preparation for Habitat 3. He's led some projects in some 20 countries on 3 continents, leading to over 50 national and international awards for professional and design excellence. And I feel a bit overwhelmed after all that. But please, can we put our hands together now to welcome Brian Evans.
Anyway, from the past to the future, I wanted to start with an acknowledgement. There was a time in Scotland, a unique band of people, and 3 of them in particular had a big impact on me. Ian McHarg, who we all know, and Mark I worked with for 20 odd years, and he was immensely encouraging and supportive. But in particular, Mark was my link with McHarg, and through him and the people who trained with McHarg in Pennsylvania, there is a sort of coherence, and it's wonderful. I see Ian is here this evening, Ian White. Bill Cairns, Brian Clouston, a number of people who, when we were starting out, we had the opportunity to work with. I mean, I've been on this for a long time, the relationship of the Sublime and the Picturesque in Scotland. I mean, when you go to places in England, very beautiful and picturesque, of course there's sublime landscapes in England too, but in Scotland you're never far away from a lump of rock, something visceral. You know, you turn a corner and it intrudes into our cities, and it's very strong, huge influence. Of course it gets appropriated for films. The Hogwarts Express runs through the Glenfinnan Viaduct. But you know, this is archetypal Scotland, isn't it? With this cultivation, but the strong armature of the country breaking through. Bill Cairns asked me to give a keynote when LIS was 50 years old, and Bill was super excited. 50 years, Brian. The Landscape Institute in Scotland has been going for 50 years, and your Bill Gillespie was the first landscape practice. And all the time that Bill was talking to me about this 50 years, I was thinking, yes, but I mean, Scotland's been around for a long time. You know, it's 50 million years. We're scratching at this. And I started, of course, in the earth sciences. Scotland's landscape is geological, heroic, and if I just scroll through these images, it has this sublime nature, particularly in certain lights. This geology, the stacks, and then in these photographs from Patricia MacDonald, we see the scratching of the surface by ice, or the scratching of the surface by man, tiny little things, the disruption in the flow country there, for example, in the right image, or indeed the Croft landscape from the Western Highlands. Glenfeshie here juxtaposed with Muirburn, and then fishing, and I love this remnant that you see. And of course, as we move through this, we come now to the Anthropocene and what we are doing to the landscape. And at that conference, I talked about how Scotland's landscape demands care and it demands courage. And certainly once upon a time, we were able to do that. This is Loch Fascally, with the hydro scheme, where that new parkland was created around about. So here's an industrial enterprise that creates parkland. Stunning. Their Stirling University campus. And even in oil and gas, there was a huge concern that somehow this would be sat in the landscape. We would take care of it. And I posed the question about whether or not this is courageous. It's not so much, it wasn't me railing against renewable energy. It's just, the minister spoke at that conference and he said, well, you know, we set the targets and then each case is decided on its merits, and we get them somewhere and I said, Minister, that's not good enough. It's just not good enough. We had a national policy for oil and gas. We should have a national policy for renewables. It's managerial what we do. Well, I've always loved this quote by Frank Muir, and it brings into register, I think, the juxtaposition of the sublime and the picturesque. This is Farragon Ridge up in Perthshire, where Sue and I have a wee place. And I'm always conscious, I mean, this is maybe not the most sublime of Scotland's landscapes, but still it's awe-inspiring when you're up there on Farragon. And you know, we do all commune, don't we? What's it all about? I don't know, but whatever it is, this is what it's about. And you can walk just 100 meters and look into Strathtay, and you're looking into a picturesque landscape. I've always been profoundly influenced by the artists, the way artists see things. And these are a couple of shots of the Hudson Massif in the United States from the American Sublime. And when we first painted big landscapes, people were always wee. They were always intimidated by the setting. Don't quite know what's going on there, some sort of ancient ritual, but they're small. And here we are, closer to home, Cadaridris, and we've got the happy, bucolic youth frolicking about out there. But he's small beside Cadar. By the time Caspar David Friedrich is painting, man is occupying the foreground. And by the time we get to Gilpin, well, the mountains are away in the back and it's gay abandon. The nymphs, we are taming landscape. We're coming to terms with it. And this led on, didn't it, to, in the evolution of things, to the pleasure gardens. Vauxhall pleasure gardens here. And one of my favorite stories that the Tsar came to see Vauxhall pleasure gardens, came to spend time with his cousin. And he said to his entourage, he'd been at Vauxhall, and he said, we have to have a Vauxhall. We must have that. And so his people wrote it all down very assiduously, and they built him a Vauxhall. And he said, Niet, this is not what I wanted at all. But Majesty, we've built it to celebrate your most famous castles. And of course, he was talking about Vauxhall Gardens, not Vauxhall Station. Vauxhall Station's just beside. And in case you think this is an urban myth, I mean, the Russian word for station is Vauxhall. And so they have, this is Kievsky Vauxhall, which is Kievsky Station. And you go to Moscow, and the major continental rail lines all run out from Vauxhalls. So it's a kind of, but I digress. But it's a nice story, and I've always enjoyed it. Drummond, classical, the picturesque. We are ordering, we are laying things out, we're mannering, and it gives on to the Victorian pleasure gardens. But by the 1960s, we weren't doing too much of that. It's your fault. The Plan Voisin made real in Barcelona. This is the Park Hill Flats, for example, in Sheffield. And there was a small group of people. You can see some of them here. 5 of them, I think. Each wrote a book in the 1960s. An Englishman, a Scotsman, and 3 Americans, actually. Ed Bacon over on the right. And there's lots of others in here as well. McHarg, Kevin Lynch, Gordon Cullen. And of course, McHarg brought ecology into the city. His sieve mapping, which we all know, and I have used for many, many years in big scale things. And I think actually in the 25th anniversary edition of Design with Nature, McHarg puts his finger on it himself. He talks about the fact that to a greater or lesser extent, nature was over there. It was protected. It was protected by the Sierra Club. It was protected in the national parks. But we despoiled our cities. And if he wasn't the first, he was one of the very first who said, nature and ecology, the landscape of the city is important. This was McHarg's big move, I think, and his techniques for understanding the ecology and the wisdom or lack of it for building cities. And as an urbanist, I was so focused on that, where the water system was. And I weep when I work in China and I see them paving over everything and failing to understand the carrying capacity. And of course he drew, and as an earth scientist who had trained in planning and regional planning, then there was this magic that you could use this in a design. You could purpose, you could create an intent from what you wanted to do. One of the best examples, I think, of McHarg's work delivered actually is the landscape master plan for Milton Keynes. Poor old Milton Keynes. It's a fantastic piece of work by Derek Walker, study of an architect, study of capacity, how things fitted in, his understanding of the water system, the typology of landscape, and this separating out of layers for woodland, for different types of habitat, deconstructing the master plan into layers, reconstructing it to create a network, a neighborhood. It was kind of ahead of its time. And he did something, he made a move which influenced us in Gillespie's quite a lot. He needed a balancing pond to be able to accommodate drainage. And I mean, this is, what's this, 1980 or something like that? It's a long time before SUDS, before it was the lingua franca for everybody. And he had the idea that rather than it being unsightly in the summer, why not make it deep enough so the water fluctuated? It was a proper balancing pond. And when we had the opportunity to work in Scunthorpe, but anyway, there was a lot. But we were able to work with the geography of Scunthorpe. Abercrombie had been there. We got into the archives. They found the appointed Abercrombie to create a plan for the industrial garden town. And do you know what? Things never change, because as we're going through the archive, we find a letter from Abercrombie to the then council saying, why have you not paid my fees? I sent you the report. And it was for something like, I don't know, £7.17 6 or something. An industrial garden town from Sir Patrick Abercrombie. So a new geography, and we talked about the relationship, and at the time the Environment Agency were looking for areas for flood attenuation, and we said, well, why not have a great big balancing pond rather than inundating farmland? Put some lakes beside Scunthorpe on Trent. One day I'll write them up. Anyway, as a scientist coming to this, I've always loved this basic diagram of the biomes. And it's surprising when you work internationally and you work with other colleagues, when they're saying, I wonder what will grow here. Well, I mean, if you've studied this and you know about plant associations and soils and geology and climate, you know, generally speaking, what's going to grow, don't you? And I thought that was a revelation that people didn't know that when we went off to Russia and start thinking about. And it was interesting to go. Here's Glasgow, Copenhagen, and Moscow, all on the same latitude. It's just we have a maritime climate. They don't. We think they're a long way apart, but when you see it in a different perspective, we're not so far. And I found the pre-revolutionary paintings, Savrasov, Shishkin, these amazing skies, the poetry, the paint. It could be Montana, couldn't it? Huge vistas. This is a very famous painting, not the best light. There's 45 different tones of black in this painting over the river Dnieper. Even Shishkin with these minute handling of forests. And look, the little jay, tiny work. And there's this visceral, strong, melancholic relationship that the Russians have with landscape and with the seasons. They have the mud season like they do in Northeast America, for example. Savrasov, the rooks have returned. My own favorite is Itzhak Levitan, the spring freshet. And I started to look for the details. I found this pre-revolutionary landscape still there in Moscow, when they were wanting to cover it with ticky-tacky boxes. And so Evans started to talk about capacity and screening and how, and this was the way I found I could appeal to oligarchs, to appeal to their poetry, their literature, and their art, to get them interested in landscape. The Vladimirka Road to Siberia, from which you never return, still there, And I found all these details, and I actually got them interested in some of that, in the positioning, thinking about the capacity. Their definition of landscape is interesting. But we used Levitan and the cultural landscape to show them that these pictures are just, 5 years old or something like that. This is by the River Moscow, and well, they're both by the River Moscow, in fact. And then we were able to show how what they were doing to Levitan's landscape and invite them to think about something. A dozen years ago, we were drawing. I mean, you were out there with tracing paper and magic markers, enough to last you for a couple of weeks. It was like working in gear, the first big project I worked on, Glasgow Eastern Area Renewal Project, Scottish Development Agency. You were kind of special forces. You were sent out with enough tracing paper and magic markers, and if you were to last you for 2 weeks, and if you were taken prisoner, they would deny all knowledge of you, And things have changed a bit these days with community. So we drew all of this, myself and the estimable Graham Pert from Gillespie's, who drew a lot of this. And Graham said to me one evening, he said, Brian, we're masquerading as landscape architects here. I mean, I'm an architect, and you're an earth scientist and a planner. And I said, well, never mind. Let's just see if we can tell McHarg's story. And we were so proud of this. We worked with somebody from the architectural practice to distort the landscape. You couldn't do it in those days. We managed to show this and tell the story. Graham didn't quite get my description of kettle holes, how the ice was left in the land, but by this time it was 2:00 in the morning, and we went back to the primordial forest and so on. And well, I won't Graham did some wonderful pencil sketches. We always start with the drawing, but here we are 5 or 6 years later, where technology's moved a long way, and now we can somehow, by hook or by crook, all levels are secret in Russia, so you need to access the, you need to have good contacts in order to be able to get topographic information. But then we were able to apply McHarg and use computer technology to do this. Still, the hand drawings are best. And we discovered, of course, with Photoshop, you can disassemble Photoshop. You can create these layers of the landscape. But you had to make sure that the guys who were putting it in understood that certain colors needed to be on certain layers in order to be able to, yeah, but that's forest, do you understand? That's informal. But this is formal. Oh, is that why it's a different, yes, that's why it's a different color. So we want to be able to separate these out. But the artist's eye, we would be showing plans like this to people, and then this, and say, and they would say, oh, is that the site? I mean, you still get that with certain developers. Is that the site? It was quite nice. You think, oh, they've not been to see the site, you know. And the proposition of these visualizations done by Chris Swan, who's now with ERTS. And Chris is a master of bringing out the the languid young lady and the interior shots. I mean, never needed briefing on this. Chris would do that himself, and we were forever indulging in the borrowed landscape and the layers. And there's 3 things I need to tell you about this visualization. The first is that we're borrowing landscape from next door and woodland walks. The second is that the character in the middle there is Chris's brother, and this is a dear friend, Fred London from JTP, who's a bird watcher. And Chris's brother and Fred appear in all of the visualizations that Gillespie's did for about 10 years across China, the Middle East, and Russia. And so we were able to more recently, with the competition for the expansion of Moscow, strip it right down to, it would say to the mayor of Moscow, the water comes into Moscow clean and it goes out filthy. Moscow's a toilet. If you can have the water leave Moscow more or less the quality that it comes in, everything else falls in place, because everything's been translated. You're getting this translated into another language. And so we constantly using McHarg, and architects like to make big gestures. I see a large circular lake here, and we'd say, yeah, but look, there's all these little valleys, and if you just build a tiny wee dam, you'll get a series of cascades like outside Edo in Tokyo. So the competition for and the architects built the structure, the armature of the plan around about, and it worked well, I think, the superimposition of, Ian would say, a Cartesian plan on top of an interpretation using McHarg's technologies and systems. But something was bugging me, and I loved this cartoon, from the Stone Age. We've got clean air, water is pure, everything's organic, lots of exercise, nobody lives past 30. And it's a sort of piece of post-truth, I think, and some kind of fallacy. But then I discovered the rewilding, and taking, which troubled me, I have to say. Not that we're reintroducing species, not that we are reafforesting, but are we rewilding? And when you come into the city, now Nigel, and this is the Barbican. To be fair to Nigel, I mean, I don't think Nigel has ever claimed that but some people are talking about this is not wild. I mean, yes, it's biodiverse, of course it is. It encourages species, but it's all managed to within a millimetre of its life. You know, what are you doing? You've fallen over? Cut it out, put another one in. You know, I mean, this, I think then was prominent in my mind. And a couple of years ago, I was asked to chair Sue's forum, and that really. We had Harry Burns, who I'll say something about in a moment, talking about salutogenic landscapes, and the opportunity to reflect on 5 years and to think about the way people think about landscape and order it and structure it and try and bring some degree of coherence to that was interesting. So we took the different approaches, and one of the things I've learned over the years is that although everybody thinks about what they do, they reason differently. So in the introduction to the book, I talk about the different reasoning that designers have to policy people. And so we ordered it into learning from thought, because that's a certain kind of thinking about the environment. The people who do and the people who make, the people who deliver and the people who make things. And they reason about things, and we structured it in that way. Jonathan Porritt was great, actually. I mean, his paper got transcribed, and he was very quick. We didn't want pictures, so we pulled out quotes for Jonathan. The heroes and visionary of tomorrow are in our schools today. The more they are involved today, the more likely they are to become the leaders of tomorrow. This is important with next week and the wretched Trump. I need to edit that bit out. And what we are doing. I mean, there was a degree of hegemony, was there not? Natura 2000, red data species. There was a settled view about these things, and we are in danger of throwing that out. Very important. And when you have somebody like Harry Burns, former Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, understanding if people have a reason to live, that's behind his. I mean, his chapter on salutogenic landscapes, wellness not illness, is incredibly important. And when you have the Chief Medical Officer saying to us as a profession, society needs to do more to design spaces that allow people to come together and socialize. Of course we would say that, but like me, you will all have been there, saying to people, and say, well, of course you would say that because it's in your interest, because you want to, as if all we were interested in was the fee that's associated with transforming the city or the landscape rather than other things. And it's fantastic to have this body of empirical evidence to support interaction. Johnny Hughes' piece echoes McHarg, talks about fragmentation, ecosystem services. It is a complete echo of McHarg from 40, 50 years ago, where he's talking about the fact that the connectivity is as important as the cherished places, and very, very important. And Tom Armour talking about heat islands, greening, which we all now know, but that's a huge move forward, and I will bring this back to the aesthetics in a minute or two. Peter Head, I always wonder, has he got a cousin called Fraser Burra? I mean, I could never take it. I think actually what Peter is talking about is the cyclical economy and carbon sequestration. Actually, he is taking it out there. The doers, the regional project that's Eba Emshire Park, the cultural landscapes of the South Pennines, of course, our own work here. And Andy Scott always gets the attribute, the totemic. But for me, Ironside Farah's Helix Park is, I've said to Julian, you know, it's a European quality, this. And he's very relaxed about it. It's always but Sue and I were assiduous when we were doing this, that if the designers weren't credited, we wrote it in and added it in to the footnotes. Philadelphia, where they really got under the skin of it. Regulation, relating suds, doing it well, not kid-on stuff with trays on top of the street, but actually having the water migrate through the terrain itself, but taking it into the fiscal system and the taxation system to make sure that it happened from the tap to the river, if you like. People understood they needed to engage with it. The makers, the High Line, and Pete Audolph's Planting, and here we are again with this, which eventually Sue and I called ecophilic planting. I mean, there's so much today talked about biophilic design, which is important, but biophilic design still, by and large, puts us in the center. So we use the term ecophilic for what Audolph is trying to do. I love his quote. I was looking it up. You know, he was on the telly with Monty Don recently. He said he hates over floralistic plants. It's a wonderful quote. Why does he use so many grasses? So yes, they are natural, but they are managed. They are encouraging bio-rich biodiversity, but it's a different aesthetic. This is not picturesque. This is not sublime. It is, in our view, ecophilic. Chongi Chong River. And so you'd be delighted to know I'm not going to read this out, but we brought this together into a kind of 10-point proposition, really, that first of all, urban growth with urban concentration. By the middle of this century, 80% of our people globally will live in cities. The vast majority of people will experience nature in city regions. They will experience the ecosystems of city regions. It will be the few who experience it outside. Climate change, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Trump, but it has to be front and center. Of course we don't know all the detail, we don't know the detailed causality, but we know enough to know that the climate is changing, that we have events, that we have flooding, that heating is affecting health, that's affecting biodiversity loss. Wellness, health, salutogenic, designing for health. If you do these other things, you take care of the man and the woman as well. Stewardship of the water system. I mean, with our experience in China, you know, it's so important. The work I did for the United Nations was for the UNECE, the Economic Commission for Europe. North America, EU and EFTA, Russia, the CIS countries, and Turkey, Israel, and the Balkans. That region has 17% of the world's population, nearly 50% of world's GDP, and 65% of the world's fresh water. And our politicians wonder why people want to come here. I mean, the North is the Garden of Eden. And these people all live between the Tropic of Cancer and the Arctic Circle. It's a temperate, wrapped around by the boreal forest, a biome that's growing at 3% per annum, unlike the Amazon rainforest. The water system, the causality of cities along water systems, the great Mississippi-Missouri basin, the Rhine-Danube and the Volga-Dnieper river systems. Something like 70% of the people in these cities live on these water systems, and they're all interconnected. From this evidence, these papers, if you like, in fact, economy and technology were seen seen to be huge advantages. They weren't seen. A number of people said money is not the problem. There's plenty of money. We're not using it well. Technology is there for us. So whereas we have issues with health, whereas we have issues with poor stewardship of water systems, economy and technology are there for us and advantageous. Best practice is hugely developed. So there is much more knowledge and understanding of best practice. And there's an emerging new normal that we have or had, because it's in danger, I feel, but we had managed to bring nature out of the closet, bring it into the mainstream. It was a mainstream consideration, pan-European, certainly. And the new landscape aesthetic. The fact that in Scotland in particular, no longer is it a composition or a collision solely between the picturesque and the sublime. The ecophilic is part of it too, when we all put together these planting schemes and deliver them. So we have this composition of ecophilic, picturesque and sublime in Scotland, and we need to strike a balance between that in terms of our respect for the environment. Getting it into the mainstream, I mean, Chris Smout is good on this with his papers that he wrote for SNH when they were set up. Talks about how it was so much a specialist activity, and it has become so much more important. And then finally, green infrastructure. That cities and regions require a network of natural, semi-natural landscape and water, green infrastructure, that's equal of their networks of transport and utilities, engineering infrastructure. This will ensure the benefits of natural and semi-natural environments work well for natural human habitats, ecosystem services, because we have to demystify these words, don't you? Say ecosystem services, First Minister, she says, what's that? Or if she's any sense, she says, what's that? Through a process of designing and regenerating, now we call that retrofitting cities, towns, neighbourhoods, to create elegant, economically viable and resilient places, biophilic, ecophilic urbanism, that are socially balanced for the benefits of their population wellness. And we finished off with the Scottish Sublime, the English Picturesque, and the Wretched Garden Bridge, which nonetheless demonstrates this ecophilic proposition in the city. So that was the 10-point proposition that's contained in growing awareness, that's built on all of that practice, that's built on the research that Sue and her colleagues have done, to invite us to think about the balance between sublime, picturesque and ecophilic in Scotland. Thank you.
I'd just like to say thank you very much, Brian. That was an absolutely wonderful journey, taking us from the age of Scotland to reminding us how important the work of Ian McHarg is still today. I mean, it's astonishing to think that that is still so pertinent today, and we still have to refer to it in our work today, and we cannot ignore it. And I also found the fact that the way that Sue and Brian had divided the book up into set up in terms of learning from thought, place and action, I thought that was excellent, because it's looking at all those different views, and it challenges some of our traditional views or assumptions as designers, and we need to do that. We can't just follow a certain route. We need to have the leaders in thought. We need to see the action on the ground where it's happened to move forward. Brian's got a very limited time, obviously, because he's got a taxi to catch, but we do have options for some questions here if there's any in the audience. Has anybody got anything burning? They're all going. I have a question. I think it's kind of referring to some of your comments last Friday, and also Peter Head in his essay, when I was grappling with it, said Scotland could be leaders. Scotland can be leaders. Do you, from your perspective, do you think that's possible to take forward these 10 main themes from your book? Well, I'm going to ask both of you. Do you think Scotland can be leaders in this?
Do you want to start?
Well, I'll start. I think it is possible. Whether or not it's doable is another matter. For the Central Scotland Green Network, we're talking about a vision that goes forward to 2050. And the challenge is, how do you keep that proposition fresh and alive through election process after election process? So how does it become so embedded that it does become every day, that there is an expectation amongst all of us that this type of landscape treatment, the integration of nature into our cities is good for us, and that collectively we're prepared to actually invest in it. We've been doing some work recently, assisted by the Glasgow Clyde Valley Green Network Partnership, looking at the costs associated with delivering the Central Scotland Green Network. So we have a figure, we think it's about 2.8 billion. Compares very favourably with things like the A9 upgrade, which is £3 billion to upgrade the A9. So it's actually not a scary amount of money. It equates to maybe 70 odd million pounds a year, and a lot of that money is in the system. It's just not being very well used. So what we have is silo budgets where roads money is spent on roads but nothing else, and health budget is spent on health but nothing else. And part of the challenge is to embed some of this thinking so that the people who hold budgets, the people who procure new development, start to think about what can they do to actually make sure that their spend adds value across a range of the Scottish Government's priorities. And so it is doable and it is possible, but we need to maintain the pressure, I suppose. Mm-hmm. We use the forum as a way to do that, so it's a way to bring big ideas to Scotland, to keep raising the aspirations, but increasingly what we want to be able to do is to also evidence what's happening on the ground. So we want to be able to say that there are projects out there that are demonstrating some of this thinking, so that we can actually take ministers and elected members to go and see work for them to realise the incredible benefit and value that it represents to the economy, to people's lives, to our future well-being. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've done a fair amount of work in Norway over the years, and the first occasion that we were being asked to look at the small airport on an island, Vigra, related to Ålesund, and they were building a number of businesses, at a business park and things, to take advantage of the airport. All sensible, properly scaled, thought out. And we did what you always do, and we said, okay, so where's the plan for this? And the plan for this. Now, where's the landscape plan? Landscape plan. We have a lot of landscape. And I said, yeah, but look at this fish
processing plant. It was that they just graded roadstone, dumped it in the fjord, created a flat platform and put something on top of it. And we did some work for the Norwegian furniture industry. A lot of Scandinavian furniture is actually made in Norway. And it was the same when we did the Energetica project in the north of Scotland, the corridor from Aberdeen to Peterhead. All about migrating oil and gas into green technology. And I said, you have to live it. You can't sell people this if you're not prepared to live it yourself. So we came up with this idea, the Norwegians have one too. It wasn't original, but the hydrogen highway. I mean, why not have the taxis and the car clubs all run on hydrogen fuel cells? That's eminently possible to do now if you want to create these things. So I think in answer to your question, we just don't notice in Scotland that the most important asset we have is it's still a bit shortbread and tartan, I think. So I think that conceptually and culturally, with this 10-point plan, we are where we used to be with nature conservation and culture. It has to come into the mainstream. And I don't see any evidence as we turn central Scotland into European Los Angeles with a 10-lane highway. Really, when we're trying to move everybody onto trains and people are psychologically minded to move on to trains, we've created a 10-lane highway. We haven't even let the average speed camera experiment of the A9 play out before we decide to spend £2 billion. And probably we do need to dual at the A9, but do we need grade separated junctions at Ballinluig, for example? You know, I mean, we're not expecting Carmageddon there, really. So there are things like that I don't think it's. I think there's still work to do. Of course, Sue's initiative is an incredibly important one, but we're still a bit. It's like we wouldn't want to do anything because it might upset the whiskey industry or the salmon industry, and meantime, and so we're still saying we must protect the Cairngorms. But, you know, it won't matter if we shove all the transmission lines through here. Mark Turnbull used to tell me he was profoundly against national parks for a long time because his thesis was Scotland is a national park. And if we start making these, people say, well, that's all right because that means outside. And, you know, we're dumping all of this stuff in between the Trossachs and Cairngorms National Park now. So I think we're some way off yet. I think there's work to be done. And unfortunately, with the way national politics are at the moment, we've been hugely deflected from some of these important things. Now, who knows? I'm probably too old to have the hope that if Britain repatriates a lot of the robustness from Europe about you know, I mean the moaning and complaining about the fisheries policy, for example. But the North Sea has, to a greater or lesser extent, been restocked. It would have been fished out if we hadn't had that. So maybe this will all come back. Maybe Holyrood will be empowered with all of this, and perhaps we will take this to our heart to understand that it's integrated, that the economics, the social issues, the wellness, the health, the economic vitality, and the beauty of the natural are all integrated, and we'll start doing something about it. But I think we're not there yet. We're not there yet compared to some of the countries that we seek to emulate. Scandinavian countries, Austria maybe. You know, I don't think so. But that's down to us.
Yeah, I know.
It's down to us.